Hey everyone, I want to talk just really briefly about neurodevelopmental trauma and what it does to the brain, particularly in regard to arousal level. So, the bulk of this is actually going to be true for any human, but definitely any kiddo. So, what you need to know about the brain is that there are lots of parts to the brain, but out of all of the parts of the brain, you only have a couple of parts that think, and those are right up here, kind of in the far front parts of the brain. So, that prefrontal cortex right behind your forehead, and the frontal lobe that sits kind of right behind it. The rest of the brain just does what the brain does, and the rest of the brain is actually really good at that and really, really fast at that. The parts of your brain that actually think are slower. Anytime your arousal goes up, so think about arousal as stress, okay? So anytime that sympathetic nervous system kicks on and our arousal starts to kind of increase, anytime that happens, we move farther and farther back into our brain. And the more survival pieces are back here, really emotional reactive pieces are kind of buried in the middle of your brain there. And then again, we have those thinking parts up front. So any human gets stressed out. The more stressed out you are, the farther back in your brain you go. And I really actually prefer the word arousal to stress because stress often has a negative connotation and it doesn't have to. So you can think about arousal as excitement. You can think about arousal as being with other people. So we know, for example, that with adolescents in particular, they're really sensitive to crowds. And so crowds being with peers and the higher number of peers creates a higher arousal kind of setting. And so tends to actually, again, push them back farther into the brain. So that's true for all humans. And what we know is that when we're talking about brain development, most of your brain is underdeveloped at birth. A brain stem, which does a lot of your basic survival things, is going to be the only part of your brain that's fully functional at birth, assuming full term gestation. And then we kind of grow farther and farther up. A prefrontal cortex right behind your forehead that controls your executive functioning has kind of three big jobs of thinking to the future, understanding consequences, and impulse control. And those three jobs of that prefrontal cortex, that part of your brain doesn't even start developing until about the age of 3. It will grow really slowly through elementary school and then it will pick up speed in adolescence, where on average humans reach full neurologic maturity about the age of 22. So when we have that neurological development that's happening, we also have to recognize that we need to have really appropriate expectations for any young child because they are underdeveloped. They're immature, and we often give adults in our lives more grace for their behavior than we do kids when kids are dealing with brains that have very little executive functioning control. So all of us at certain points get more aroused and really shift kind of towards the back of our brain, more in that at least emotional reactive part, if not even pure survival pieces. And it's just that most of us only visit that level of arousal, where kids with developmental trauma tend to hang out there. That kind of is their baseline and where they live. So what that means is that the farther in arousal we go back, the more we start losing access to thinking. And certainly the thinking is not going to be the first response that you see. So thinking is an intentional act, um, but the limbic system does reactive stuff. And the reactive piece can actually happen from start to finish in only 50 milliseconds. And so your brain can sense or perceive potential threat in the environment. So think of your five senses and things like that. Potential doesn't have to be a real threat. Its job is to scan for threat actually multiple times a second. So it can scan for threat, find a potential threat in the environment, and activate a stress response in less than 50 milliseconds start to finish. And by stress response, I mean fight, flight, freeze. And those are going to be a lot of the behaviors that we see in kids that we don't particularly like, whether that's aggression or screaming or running or rudeness or anything like that. Most of the time, the stress responses we see in kids really encompass the negative behaviors that we're not liking to see that are routine in a lot of the kids, especially our higher flyer kids. So when we look at that, what we need to understand is that when that behavior kind of comes out really fast, that was not an intentional choice, that was a reaction. And when we look at reactive behavior, then we have to understand that it needs to be structured and taught in a different way than if we are looking at an intentional choice behavior. So, a quick strategy that you can actually use is if a behavior comes really, really fast from the kid, so it's like verbal vomit, they say something rude really, really quickly, or they react really quickly and scream, just sort of giving a second or giving a prompt like redo, try again in a really pleasant way can sometimes be all they need to basically have the kind of cue to pause, switch to frontal, give the right behavior that's intentional. And then we want to actually reinforce the intentional behavior and kind of ignore the unwanted behavior as much as we can. Too often we end up reacting to the reaction itself that we get from our kids. And then what ends up happening is that we kind of reinforce and ingrain that. And we don't ever give time for the intentional behavior to come out. And kids really need kind of that motor memory. They need to be able to go through the intentional behavior for it to be kind of learned the best way possible and become easier to access. So a really big kind of just strategy is just try to keep arousal level low when you're wanting to teach something. When you are wanting to um, kind of correct a behavior, if possible, just try pausing if it's not a safety issue to see whether or not you can kind of get that intentional response. And you'll see pretty quickly whether or not your kids are able to give the intentional response with just a prompt or whether they're going to need some more support, which would require additional strategies.